This is African American History is American History. Welcome. I'm your host, Harlan Kearsley. This program's goal is to foster understanding, promote discussion, and expand knowledge through stories of historical events, bios of unsung heroes, as well as timely and relevant news stories which hopefully will paint a vivid picture of the effects of segregation, discrimination, and bigotry on the lives of both blacks and whites. Comparisons will be made between the many racially fractured periods of American history and what's going on right now. In 1946, the U.S. Supreme Court banned segregation on all interstate bus travel. And in 1960, the Supreme Court's Boynton v. Virginia decision extended that earlier ruling to include bus terminals, restrooms, and other facilities associated with interstate travel. However, the Deep South felt that integrated restrooms was a bridge too far and totally ignored the ruling. The Freedom Riders were groups of black and white civil rights activists who participated in bus trips throughout the South to protest segregated bus terminals. The Freedom Rides began in May of 1961 and ended late that same year. The rides were organized by the Congress of Racial Equality's National Director, James Farmer. Their mission: to test compliance with the two Supreme Court rulings. On May 4th, 1961, a group of 7 African Americans and 6 whites left Washington, D.C. on an exercise of their constitutional rights, called Freedom Rides. Many of the riders were still teenagers and needed their parents' permission to take part in the protests. Many were college students, like a young man named John Lewis, who would go on to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in November of 1986. Unfortunately, we lost Representative Lewis to cancer in 2020. They left in 2 Greyhound buses bound for New Orleans. When they stopped along the way, white riders used facilities designed for blacks and vice versa, all the while knowing that this act of peaceful protest could and did have violent consequences. The group traveled through Virginia and North Carolina, drawing little public notice. The first violent incident occurred on May 12th in Rock Hill, South Carolina. John Lewis, who at the time was a seminary student and member of SNCC, white freedom rider and World War II veteran Albert Bigelow, and another black rider, were viciously attacked as they attempted to enter a whites-only waiting area. The next day, the group reached Atlanta, Georgia, where some of the riders split off onto a Trailways bus. Along their routes, the riders were met with intimidation, beatings, and prison sentences. On May 14th, 1961, the Greyhound bus was the first to arrive in Anson, Alabama. There, an angry mob of about 200 white people surrounded the bus, forcing the driver to continue past the bus station. The mob followed the bus in cars, and as the tires on the bus were shot out, someone threw a bomb into the bus. The Freedom Riders escaped the bus as it burst into flames, only to be brutally beaten by members of the surrounding mob. The second bus, the Trailways vehicle, traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, and those riders were also beaten by an angry white mob, many of whom brandished metal pipes. This is African American History is American History. On Sunday, May 14th, Mother's Day, the Freedom Riders arrived in Birmingham. This was after a rough experience in Anson, Alabama, where one of their buses had been firebombed and burned in an act of violence by members of the Ku Klux Klan. A number of Klan members boarded the new Greyhound bus and beat the riders. By the time they reached the terminal in Birmingham, a larger mob of Klansmen and news reporters were waiting for them. The riders and some of the reporters were beaten viciously with metal bars, pipes, and bats. Bull Connor, who knew exactly where and when the Freedom Riders were to arrive, purposely held back his police force. This allowed the Klan time to rampage, unrestrained, for a full 15 minutes. When the police finally did arrive, not a single arrest was made at the scene. Connor blamed the slow police response on many factors, but the most inventive was the one he gave to the press. There were no policemen in sight as the buses arrived because they were all visiting their mothers on Mother's Day. This is African American History is American History. Despite the vicious attacks, the Freedom Riders continued on to Mississippi. By now, the entire world had watched on television the savage violence that took place in Alabama. President John F. Kennedy personally called Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett to ensure the safety of the riders. Governor Barnett agreed that there would be no mob violence. He instead had the Freedom Riders arrested the minute they arrived at the terminal in Jackson, Mississippi. The riders were all convicted and sent to the Mississippi State Penitentiary. Now, since the beginning of the 20th century, this was one of the most notorious prisons in America. Governor Barnett later stated, quote, "We don't want to break their bones. We only want to break their spirits." End quote. This is African American History is American History. Miraculously, none of the Freedom Riders were killed. Many are still alive today to speak about their experiences. Frank Holloway was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders in 1961. He was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and at the time of the rides was a 22-year-old student attending Delaware State College. He spent his career working for poverty and employment programs in Atlanta and Fulton County before eventually retiring from the Fulton Atlanta Community Action Authority. Frank Holloway, Freedom Rider and SNCC veteran, passed away on May 12, 2018, at his home in Texas at the age of 79. He was 63 when he was interviewed about his time as a Freedom Rider.
I was 22 years old in 1961. I took a break from Delaware State College and came back to Atlanta. We were active in sit-ins and picketing against segregated facilities in Atlanta. The restaurant Lester Maddox owned, the Pickwick, that was the worst one. All of the restaurants eventually desegregated after the students continued to sit in, and we closed them up. In fact, Atlanta was probably the best among the southern cities at not having violence. Me and another student, Harold Andrews, started our Freedom Ride at the Greyhound bus station in Atlanta. We started by sitting in the restaurant. We sat there for half an hour, and they closed the restaurant, turned out the lights. One of the black guys that worked in the kitchen said he would serve us because no one else would. We found out we were the first blacks to be served at that restaurant. When we got to Montgomery, Alabama, the city was in an uproar. They were burning cars, and the streets were full of whites doing everything possible to tear things down. We came in on the bus, and we found out the mob had been told there were 2 Freedom Riders coming from Atlanta on the Greyhound. The mob met us, and of course, they threatened us while we were on the bus. The bus pulled into the station, and we got off and went straight to the white waiting room. The manager told us to go to the black waiting room. We refused to go. The police were called in, and we were arrested. We were only there for a couple of hours. We were sort of put out of the jail, and the police officer said, "You are on your own." We were trying to get to the church where Martin Luther King Jr. and all of the other Freedom Riders were there to have a mass meeting. We were afraid of what would happen. Finally, we got a black cab driver. And I give him credit for being a brave cab driver. He took us to the meeting. We drove through the mob. I didn't harbor any bitterness. I accepted Dr. King's premise of nonviolence, that you don't hate your enemies. Frank Holloway.
Judy Freeze Wright is a white Jewish woman born and raised in the then all-white town of Newton, Massachusetts. During her senior year at Smith College, she heard about the sit-ins and protests that were going on in the South. So, after graduation, she decided to travel to Montgomery to join a freedom ride. Freeze's participation is an example of how the mission of the freedom rides spread beyond the South and resonated with a diverse cast of allies. Freeze and the other riders were arrested and sentenced to the Mississippi State Penitentiary just for attempting to desegregate a white waiting room. After being released, she returned home where the Boston Globe ran a series of articles sharing her perspective on being jailed while fighting for desegregation.
I endured my prison sentence and found it almost bearable because I was fighting for a cause in which I believed, and others were fighting with me. The movement achieved many lasting things back then, and its triumphs and tragedies are there to be studied, and its lessons applied to our present-day issues. My story is just one of the hundreds that could be told by the people who did the day-to-day civil rights work. The efforts of nameless individuals made the civil rights movement a truly historical and nation-changing event. We must never forget, especially in these times, the power of passionate and determined individuals working together to make change. Judy Freeze Wright.
This is African American History is American History. The widespread racial violence perpetrated on the Freedom Riders sent shockwaves throughout this nation and affected society internationally as well. The Freedom Riders helped inspire participation in later civil rights campaigns, such as voter registration throughout the South. Their actions brought national attention to the injustices of segregation and helped to pave the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This has been African American History is American History. The episode you've been listening to, Freedom Riders, Challenging Segregation, was written and directed by Harlan Kearsley. The voice actors for this episode were Robert McKay as Frank Holloway and Rebecca Downs as Judy Freeze Wright. I'm Harlan Kearsley, and on behalf of everyone here at African American History is American History, thank you for listening. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to the channel. It's easy and free. Once you hit the subscribe button and the bell icon, you'll be notified as soon as new episodes are posted. Thanks again, and please stay safe. African American History is American History. Copyright H.C. Kearsley, 2023.